everyone. Welcome. I know that there's probably some people are going to trickle in from the waiting room, but let's get started on our panel today. So welcome, everyone, to the panel on trees, racial and environmental equity, and valuing natural capital. It's really great to see you all here today, and thank you so much for your time in joining us. My name is Hanna Morris, and I'm a Postdoctoral Fellow at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm working on a book examining climate change, media, and politics. I will be the moderator for today's event. And before I turn it over to our all-star lineup of speakers today, I would like to thank Natalie Walker from Penn Sustainability, who organized this panel and made it all possible. Thank you so much, Natalie, for making this event happen. I would also like to thank Simon Richter, Elizabeth Main, Melissa Brown-Goodall, and the amazing team behind Climate Week at Penn, of which today's event is a part of. And for those of you who haven't already, please be sure to check out the incredible lineup of climate change events that are being held this week as a part of Climate Week at Penn. Also, a note that this panel discussion is one of a two-part event, including both today's virtual panel discussion and then also a tree planting event on Saturday. The goal of these two events is to shift the way our community views nature in our urban spaces by encouraging participants to engage with the benefits and challenges of natural resources through the example of the tree. The tree planting event will take place on Saturday, September 25th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. and more information is available on our panel's event page, which is on the Climate Week at Penn website. Now, in terms of logistics for today's event, each of our three panelists will present for around 15 minutes and we will close with an audience Q&A during the last 15 minutes or so. For the audience Q&A, please feel free to type questions and submit them via the chat box, and I'll read them aloud for you. Or you can press your raised hand icon when the audience Q&A begins, and I will call on you, and you can unmute and ask your question. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted and your video muted as well during all other times of today's event. So our three speakers today are Zonia Moore, Lara Roman, and Joel Pannell. Zonia Moore is an MD candidate at the Perelman School of Medicine here at Penn. In addition to working in the wards of a hospital, Zonia continues her organizing work aimed at changing policy within the healthcare system through the Vote ER Civic Health Fellowship. Lara Roman is a research ecologist for the Forest Service Philadelphia Field Station. Her research centers on the temporal dynamics of urban forests, including tree mortality and growth, canopy cover change, historical legacies, species composition change, and citizen science monitoring. Joel Pannell is the Vice President of Urban Policy at American Forests, where he oversees efforts to build and promote the organization's positions on a range of urban forest policy and related social equity issues. So now I will turn over to why you're all here, the main speakers. So Zonia will present first, followed by Lara, and then Joel. So Zonia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi there, everyone. I am on shift in the hospital today, so please excuse any background noise. Let me know if I need to repeat anything if I get talked over. I, last year, in partnership with one of the leaders of the healthcare sustainability group at Penn Medicine, founded the Southwest Philly Trees Initiative, which TREE stands for Towards Racial and Environmental Equity. So what is this initiative? As you're probably aware, because you're signing into this panel, there are really large disparities in urban tree canopy cover across the US. So, and this really mirrors racial segregation within American cities. So in neighborhoods where Black and brown people live, there's usually very little tree cover, which can then create heat islands. These heat islands make it very difficult for people to go outside and enjoy the summer. It makes it difficult to go outside and exercise. It worsens air quality due to increased degradation of trash and things that are in the neighborhood. And that really ultimately contributes to poorer health outcomes for these communities of color. We were fortunate enough to be funded by the Perelman School of Medicine impact funds after we submitted for the grants. And the current leaders of the initiative are Victor Ayeni, Agnes Kilwili, very bad at pronouncing her name, Chidima Wilson, and Megan Zhao, who've done an amazing job of carrying this project forward. So as a part of this program, we really have three main things that we focus on. We partner with the Southwest Philly Community Development Corporation, who had identified community greening goals through a 2-year process called the Bartram Choice Plan, where the community really said, this is how we'd like our neighborhood to look. We do want some more trees in here. We do want places that we can go together to enjoy the outdoors. We provided them with tools and supplies, a tool library for tree care, which I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. We publicize the public health benefits of trees. We've done this through community outreach. We've taken out several magazine ads. We've gone door to door and given flyers and had one-on-one conversations with residents about what the benefits of trees are and addressing any of the concerns they had related to trees. And finally, through this publicity, we really encourage residents to request free trees from the city of Philadelphia and then help provide labor to plant the trees and recruit volunteers to planting the trees as well. So successes that the program has had, we had flyer distribution. We printed 2 rounds of flyers and distributed them door to door. These flyers, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, they had scannable links to tree applications where they could get more information about what kinds of trees were going to be planted and how they can request a free tree. We had one-on-one discussions with residents about how trees can benefit their health and address the concerns that they had. We heard things like trees interfering with power lines, issues with trees breaking up the sidewalk, trees interfering with water lines, and had to explain to them that these are primarily due to the types of trees that were chosen to be planted in urban settings in the past. And we've gotten a lot better at choosing trees that aren't going to disrupt the sidewalk, that are going to have a minimal impact on power lines and that won't destroy water lines under the ground as well. The ad that we designed, which is on the right-hand side here, we ran it in the Southwest Globe Times because that's the population that we were really publishing, and that ad 6,000 people, which again explained what some of the benefits of trees are in like a nice, cute infographic way, and then made it easy for them to request more information and then also to request a tree. We also delivered a tool library to assist with new tree planting. This included I think 15 buckets. We had 6 large shovels, 6 shorter shovels. We had wood that you can use to support smaller trees, as well as twine. We included stake drivers, which can be pretty hard to come by and are really important for getting the wood into the ground in order to support the trees. And we also provided them with we connected them with some people who know more about planting trees in the city of Philadelphia, as well as what specific kinds of trees would be brought. We also recruited 13 volunteers over the course of the last year to do a socially distanced tree planting event, both in this neighborhood as well as in South Philly. And finally, let's talk about how trees help our health. The references for all of these are below. You're free to go into the literature and read a little bit more about them. But trees can help reduce blood pressure, heart rate, and muscle tension. There's a relaxation that happens to all of us when we are out in nature, even if you might not necessarily love the nature, but having urban nature nearby has been shown to reduce blood pressure. It really improves social capital. So it provides places for people to interact socially. It promotes a sense of community. It provides a central gathering place where people can spontaneously get together and enjoy each other's company. And that in turn really contributes to increasing our health by keeping us socially connected. There are beneficial immune responses to visiting forests. This has included the expression of anti-cancer proteins. I'm not saying that nature prevents cancer, but it can help our bodies in seeking out cancerous cells and in getting them out of our systems. Just like with the improved social capital, we get higher levels of physical activity because people have a place that's nice that they can go out to and enjoy, that's low cost, in order to promote physical activity, which then has benefits for our hearts and has benefits for our lungs, and also can reduce the incidence of diabetes and reduce people's risk for diabetes. There's lots of noise buffering. So noise emanating from non-natural sources can be a cause of stress for all of us. We might not recognize it, but it's sort of going on in the background, and having trees can help prevent this noise from, prevent you from hearing this noise too much. And then finally, trees help reduce air pollution. This is in terms of just overall perceptions. When people are around trees, they perceive that the quality of the air is better, but also you do see decreased levels of air pollutants and reduced carbon dioxide in trees. And that is the summary of the Southwest Philly Tree Initiative. We definitely need to acknowledge the Perelman School of Medicine Big Idea Fund. This project would not have been possible without Dr. Marilyn Howard and Dr. Akira Rodriguez, who really helped us scope out what we were trying to do and scope out and manage a project, something that could be sustained long-term for medical students. All of the people at the Southwest Community Development Corporation who are so responsive to our emails, who let us come by, and who've helped us get to know the neighborhood. That includes Donna Henry, Cynthia Ryan, and Stephen Kuzmicki. Anna Belfaz and Genevieve De Silva helped us in creating the proposal for this project. And Jeremy Shabazz, Stephanie Gregerman, and Tim Hanser are pretty instrumental in keeping us up to date about what's going on in the city of Philadelphia with regard to tree planting and when the next tree planting days are. And Tim Iffel, the director of trees at PHS, agreed to allow us to get the free trees from the city of Philadelphia to really make this project possible. And that's all I have for you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zonia. So now we'll move to Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that great presentation, Zonia. So I'm here to talk about the temporal dynamism of city trees. If you could turn to the next slide for me. And how complex urban forest systems change over time. So this picture is showing a street in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia lined with street trees. Next slide. So street trees, as well as the landscapes shown on this screen, natural forested areas, lawn trees, trees and other hardscapes like parking lots, they collectively make up the urban forest. And this term, urban forests, it's used in the US to refer to all trees in cities, towns, suburbs, and other urbanized environments. Urban forests include both trees planted intentionally, as well as trees that emerge on their own through natural processes. Next slide. Urban tree planting programs have taken off in the US and all over the world, and a lot of the justification for planting in recent years is rooted in the concept of ecosystem services, the notion that trees provide environmental, social, economic, and human health benefits, like the ones described in the previous presentation. More specifically, tree benefits are often monetized. So this tag on a newly planted tree in the Chicago area says that the tree will provide over $1,700 in benefits over the next 15 years. But what if this tree doesn't survive? And whether a planting program is planting 100 trees or 1,000,000 trees, what if many of the trees don't make it to maturity when the trees are largest and their benefits are greatest? Next slide. So much of my research emphasizes urban forest population cycles, which you can also think of as tree demography. Tree populations in urban landscapes go through cycles of planting and natural regeneration, growth, and hopefully maintenance, then eventually death and removal and replacement plantings. So this diagram is showing survivorship curves typical of planted urban trees based on a recent literature review that I co-authored. The y-axis is the percent of trees surviving, and the x-axis is years since planting. The middle curve is sort of a middle of the road survivorship, fairly typical. And then we have better than normal and worse than normal scenarios. The dashed line represents the population half-life, which is when half the planted trees can be expected to be dead. For a typical urban tree planting program, the population half-life is 13 to 18 years. And I really want to emphasize this point. In a typical tree planting initiative, only half the trees will remain alive after about 15 years. Next slide. So now I want to talk about actually an example of unusually high survival outcomes. This comes from right here in Philly with University City Green, or UC Green, which plants trees in West Philly. There were about 150 trees planted around Kingsessing Park, and 6 years later, about 90% of them were still alive. That translates to an annual mortality rate of 1.6%, which is unusually good. Next slide. And so this is an image to show you how the landscape was transformed. The view goes up 51st Street just before the planting in 2006, and then just after. Next slide. This is the same street in 2019. It's been about 15 years since the planting, and the trees are doing quite well, offering shade to pedestrians. So I published a study comparing the high survival outcomes of this program and another similar program in California, which also had astonishingly high survivorship. Both planting efforts were run by small nonprofit organizations doing their work in relatively concentrated geographic areas, which made coordinating maintenance easier, still not easy, but less challenging than taking care of trees scattered all over a large city. Also, the planting day was closely supervised by experienced staff, and there was consistent and frequent maintenance, both by dedicated staff and board members and neighbors with arboricultural or landscape architecture or other kind of relevant skills, and also by paid youth staff that were trained by all those other individuals. I can't emphasize enough how unusual it is to have paid maintenance. Most urban tree planting programs only have funding for planting, and maintenance is either done by volunteers or not at all. Next slide. So I'm going to switch gears a bit now and talk about urban tree canopy cover, which means how much of the urban landscape is covered by trees. And this map is showing the spatial patterns of tree cover in Philly. As of 2018, tree covers 20% of the city's land, although there is huge variation in tree cover across neighborhoods. Sorry, there's a printer in the background. So in our city and many others, there are broad inequities, and generally, but not always, there is higher tree cover in areas with higher income, more white residents, and no historical redlining. Next slide. So it's important to remember that tree cover is shaped over many decades. While the correlations with things like present day income are strong, correlations are not causations. And the whole story of how tree cover develops over time is more complicated. Trees and green spaces are the products of earlier decisions. Here in Philly, much of the tree cover exists in parks, and the biggest parklands are along creeks. These watershed parks were created in the late 1800s by city elites to protect the water supply and preserve scenic riparian landscapes. And then we have dense row home neighborhoods in Center City, as well as South Philly and North Philly, with very little plantable space, in contrast to the suburban style developments in the far northeast and far northwest, where homes have yards. In other words, neighborhood form has lasting impacts on tree cover, with denser, older urban neighborhoods often unable to support as many trees. Additionally, when researchers run correlations with socioeconomic data, when such data from several decades ago is used, it ends up being a stronger relationship than with present day socioeconomic status. And to state this more plainly, current tree cover reflects the decisions of people who lived in an area previously. If I plant a tree at my house today, it might be the next occupant a few decades from now who enjoys that tree when it's at a mature size. Next slide. And one critical facet to consider when we talk about tree cover patterns in Philly is that we are located in a forested biome. This means that if land is unmaintained, whether it's a vacant residential lot or a city park, trees and weedy vegetation rapidly grow. These trees might be providing some environmental benefits like carbon storage and wildlife habitat, but they are also kind of unattractive to residents. And what I'm really trying to say is that not all tree cover is socially desirable. The same phenomenon of unintentional forest emergence occurs in cities all over the eastern US, from the colder temperate climates in old industrial towns in New England to hot subtropical cities like Tampa, but not in the drier cities of the American West. Next slide. So talking more about the history of tree planting in cities, while there were many different players involved in those early tree planting efforts, I want to draw attention to the underappreciated role of women. This is Ellen Harrison. She was wife of the Penn provost around 1900, and she pretty much single-handedly led the landscape beautification efforts on the Penn campus then, directing men to plant trees. Many other wealthy women, typically white women, were organizing planting campaigns to compensate for the overcrowded, polluted conditions in industrial cities around the turn of the 20th century. And while much has changed in the tree planting world in the past century, arboriculture and urban forestry are still largely white professions, similar to environmental professions in general. And yet tree workers doing the physical labor in arboriculture are mostly men, although the nonprofit tree planting sector and government urban forestry departments now have many women. Next slide. Another thing to consider in terms of long-term changes in urban forests is the enormous tree cover losses that can occur from pest and disease outbreaks. This image comes from Milwaukee, where most of the city's street trees were American elms, and those were then wiped out by the Dutch elm disease in the 1960s. Recovering from those kinds of losses can take many, many decades as new trees slowly grow up. Next slide. So when there are mature, healthy trees in the urban landscape, it's really important to preserve them whenever possible. There are sometimes valid reasons for removing mature trees, such as concerns about structural risks to buildings and utility wires, or sometimes it's a new pest and disease coming in that prompts arborists to preemptively remove a tree before it gets sick. But sometimes tree removals result from changing landscape priorities and human aesthetic preferences. So here we have 6 large London plane trees next to the Palestra on the Penn campus, and they were planted around the 1940s. Next slide. Here are those same trees 70 years later, now around 80 feet tall. And when Schumacher Green was being designed, right here next to the Palestra, some of the designers wanted to remove those trees, but the campus landscape architect thankfully objected. Fortunately, the trees were saved during the construction and installation process of this new green space. And an analysis of ecosystem services on campus done by a previous master's student showed that in terms of carbon storage, one of these big London plane trees is doing the same work as 190 of the small trees on campus. In other words, when it comes to promoting tree benefits, preserving the mature trees we already have is just as important as planting new trees. And this speaks to a really big issue for management and policy. Sometimes tree planting initiatives talk as if we can plant our way to higher canopy levels, but we need to plant, maintain, and preserve. Next slide. So that's the end of my presentation. This image shows the leafy Penn campus. I actually wrote an entire paper on the history of the urban forest on campus. The next time you're walking through this leafy landscape, take a moment to reflect on the many decades of effort it has taken to plant, maintain, preserve, and when necessary, remove and replant these trees. With the wealth, prestige, and urban forestry expertise of campus staff, maintaining this level of canopy cover is possible, but it takes a lot of work. There are much bigger challenges to creating and sustaining tree cover in low canopy, low income communities. And many of my colleagues with organizations like Philly Parks and Rec, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and UC Green, and now Penn Physicians are working on that. If I could leave you with one take-home message, it's this. Urban forests are an anthropogenically constructed system. We humans plant city trees, we design park spaces, and it's up to us as a society to also maintain and preserve those green spaces for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. So now we'll move to Joel.
Thank you, Hannah. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joel Pannell with American Forests, and I'm going to speak to you today about tree equity and some of the federal policy opportunities to increase equitable investment in America's urban and community forests. And just building off of what Laura said in recognition of women, I'm reminded that one of our American Forest board members and vice presidents was First Lady Florence Harding, who is often credited with sort of popularizing the urban and community forestry movement. I think a big tree dedication she did for World War I, a memorial to people who had served and passed in World War I in the early 1920s. And so I'm, as the only male on this panel, I'm reminded of recognizing we have a good panel and we're in good hands, and recognizing the role of women, which is often underappreciated. So I think both Zonia and Laura have laid out really what tree equity is about, and so I don't need to talk about what that is. I will say that at American Forest, we've developed tree equity score to sort of measure that. And so tree equity score calculates a score based on how much tree canopy and surface temperature align with things like income, race, unemployment, and other health factors. And we use these scores for the 150,000 neighborhoods that represent the 486 urbanized metro areas in the contiguous United States. So that represents over 70% of the people in this country. And each score is really an indicator of how their tree canopy measures against neighborhoods in their same area. So we're not comparing, a green leafy city like Atlanta to the Southwest in Arizona. It's looking at how you compare neighborhood to neighborhood. And we see a lot of discrepancies based on tree canopy and the correlating inequities that go with that. Next slide, please. So why is this a federal policy priority? So I think that's obvious for some of us, but for some others, maybe it isn't. And really, everything I just talked about and everything the two other panelists have talked about shows that urban tree canopy is really rooted at the intersection of climate, health, and equity. And so we see this administration, which has made that a priority, made all of those things a priority. And we saw just this week, the White House launched a coordinated interagency effort to respond to extreme heat. And that announcement also included a reference to a guide that we worked on, many of my esteemed colleagues at American Forest and many, many others worked on with the U.S. Forest Service for using tree cover to address urban heat. It also includes a climate and health adaptation menu so that at the local level, folks can really explore ways that they want to use tree cover to address this problem. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, this is I think that's actually an interactive slide. So if you can hit the button, and all three will come up. And so, really, again, extreme heat. A lot of times, flooding and hurricanes and other more visible extreme weather events get more attention. But extreme heat, again, is the #1 killer of weather-related events, and it's getting worse. We know that climate change is making it worse. And so by the end of the century, scientists project that Boston is going to feel like Miami, Dallas is going to feel like Phoenix, and Phoenix is going to feel like Kuwait in terms of surface temperature. And so we know, again, that the most impacted by this are the most vulnerable amongst us. And so the elderly and the very young, those experiencing homelessness, communities of color, low and moderate income communities, our frontline communities are most impacted by climate change and specifically extreme heat. And scientists project, again, that heat-related deaths are going to move from 12,000 a year annually, or 12,000 annually across the country to over 100,000. Next slide, please. And so, in addition to saving lives, we know there's other tremendous benefits of healthy urban forests. And so, those benefits are obviously climate adaptation and resilience, carbon mitigation, improved air and water quality, improved physical and mental health, as well as the social cohesion and community development benefits as well. And just in terms of numbers, based on our tree equity score, we would need to plant and protect and maintain 522 million trees in those same 486 urbanized areas. And that would lead to all the benefits that you see there. So, 9.3 million tons of carbon sequestered, almost 500 million cubic meters of stormwater runoff avoided, over 56,000 tons of particulates and air pollution mitigated, and it would create nearly 4 million jobs. Next slide, please. So we know the risk of inequitable tree cover and the consequences of it, that people are dying and suffering disproportionately. We know where the tree canopy gaps are based on a number of data and tools, including our tree equity score. So how do we get here? And I know that both of my fellow panelists touched on this a little bit, but I think it's really interesting to dive into that a little bit deeper. This is from a New York Times article that ran on July 4th of this year when we launched Tree Equity Score. If you have a chance, I know there's a paywall with New York Times, but if you have a chance or have access to find this article, It's really cool and has some interactive graphics. And it starts with, fittingly, looking at the city of Philadelphia. And so the picture on the screenshot on the upper left is Chestnut Hill. I'm sure that many folks on this panel or in the audience know Philadelphia much better than I do. But Chestnut Hill, the median income is over 130,000. You have lush greenery that covers about 60% of the surface area. Just 5 miles away, in Nicetown, Tioga, and I'm probably messing that up, but you have in this neighborhood, the median income is about 37,000 household income. Tree cover is only 6%, and the surface temperature is almost 10 degrees higher, or more than 10 degrees higher. And so you see, again, the disproportionate impacts of the lack of tree equity, not only in surface temperature, but it correlates with all of those other socioeconomic demographics that we're looking at. Next slide, please. And so you saw there with the graphic, I didn't do a great job of explaining, but you see those areas had been redlined decades and decades ago. And I know that Lara mentioned redlining too, but it's not just redlining. I think we have to look comprehensively at a number of discriminatory policies and practices really since America's inception, but in particular, looking at the last 100 years. And you see the same story in Philadelphia play out across the country pretty much. And so there's some variance depending on geography, and there's always some outliers, but pretty much you can look at any major metropolitan area in this country and you're going to see the tree canopy gaps aligning with income, race, and other socioeconomic disparities. Next slide, please. So what can we do about it? So we at American Forest, I'm focused primarily on federal policy, but we're really trying to build a movement, a tree equity movement of how we can address these discrepancies and how we can get the right trees planted and cared for in the right places. And so we're obviously looking at increased federal investment in America's urban tree canopy, comprehensive strategy to increase tree equity. So it's not just additional federal resources, but it's working at all levels of government, working with partners and other stakeholders, supporting and uplifting groups and efforts such as the one that Zonia is leading, and really also building the urban and community forestry field to scale so that when we do get additional resources for urban and community forestry, we have the infrastructure and capacity in place to use those extra resources in the most equitable and most impactful way. Next slide, please. So specifically, what are some of the legislative opportunities? And so it's quite, the timing is great that I'm speaking to you all today. If you are paying attention to any of the political news at all that's swirling on the talk shows and across the country, we know that we're sort of at a transformative time in American history where we have the opportunity to move through some really, really significant legislation. So the reconciliation process that's being led by Democrats in the majority party in Congress right now would include $3 billion. The House Agriculture Committee approved a bill text last week that would dedicate $3 billion to the USDA Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program. And so for those of you who don't work for the Forest Service or are not familiar with that program, it's really the only dedicated program for urban tree canopy that sits within the federal government. The high water mark for funding of that program right now is about $40 million in the last fiscal year appropriations. And that 40 million included 8 million specifically for invasive species activity. And so really we're looking at a program that's funded at 30 to 40 million. $3 billion will be over 10 years. And so that is about 300 million a year. So we're looking at a potential 10-fold increase in the federal investment in urban tree canopy if the reconciliation package moves forward. That package also includes a lot of money for a civilian climate corps, so sort of a reimagined CCC from the New Deal era. There's, I think, at my last count, 13 or 14 different legislative bills that have been introduced on CCC, but the reconciliation package specifically includes over $2 billion for tree planting and other activities, other conservation activities on non-federal urban land. So really, again, getting at that community scale. The bipartisan infrastructure agreement, which is the other big piece of legislation that has been in the news, and we are, I'm getting emails right now about how Congress is trying to move both of those at the same time. I don't envy the job of congressional leadership to try to do that, but that includes significant investments in resilience. It includes $500 million for a healthy streets program that really is about tree canopy and assessing tree canopy gaps through the U.S. Department of Transportation. And then there's a lot of other standalone legislation I've mentioned there, Bipartisan Trees Act to create a program at the Department of Energy to reduce energy costs and energy efficiency related to tree cover. We have data showing that you can, people right now are saving about $7 billion a year, billion with a B, in terms of energy costs when they live in properly shaded areas. And there's a host of other legislation that's been introduced to really get at this issue of tree equity and increased investment in urban community forestry. Next slide, please. I did want to specifically talk about career pathways, because I do think that's essential to the work that we're doing. That Career Pathways is a program specifically at American Forest, where we're working in frontline communities most impacted by tree equity gaps, to train, hire, and create, again, sustainable jobs and career pathways in urban forestry. So not just seasonal work, but creating real careers. We think that's essential to doing this work equitably, that we're identifying where these tree equity gaps are. We're putting targeted investment and resources in those areas. And we're also hiring people and providing job training and workforce development for the people who live and are from and are connected to these communities. Next slide, please. And so this slide is just sort of a circle graph showing the investment right now. If you can see the little dot in the middle, that represents $40 million. And if we are able to get both reconciliation and a bipartisan infrastructure package through with the current price tags, you can see the scale of investment that would take place for urban and community forestry. And so that's what I go to work every day doing, trying to actualize that and trying to, again, get the urban and community forestry field ready to absorb this scale and this increase of investment. Next slide, please. And so this is not a great slide of talking about what we can do. I really wanted to leave you all with some action steps and things to think about, what you could do to help influence policy discussion. And so again, using that tree equity score is a tool that you can just pull up on your phone. It's treeequityscore.org. You can look directly at your neighborhood and see where those tree equity gaps are. You can overlay it with all of the other data. We really wanted to democratize this data so that everyone has it at their fingertips. So you can show up at local meetings, you can show up wherever decisions are being made, get involved in different planning processes, support community-based organizations like the one that Zonia and others are leading, and really just show up. I think, everyone always asks me where, should I be emailing my member of Congress, or should I send this off or send that off? And those things are helpful, but I think what's most impactful is doing the work in the community and showing that you're ready for you're ready for the federal government to step up and be a partner for work that's already being led at the local level. And the Dreamforce slide is just on there. I heard this morning that Salesforce, which is one of our corporate partners, is having their Dreamforce conference, and over 92 million people have been streaming that, which I was shocked by. But I really just want to, this is not just a federal policy issue. It's not just a local community-based engagement issue, but it's also, we need corporations and other folks to start showing up. Politics often follows the money, for better or worse. And so we really need to be working on the better part of that and getting involved at all levels and getting our corporate partners involved, getting everyone involved. And so if you can, over the next 2 weeks, as we're trying to nail down some numbers on reconciliation and other legislative vehicles, folks can, Saturday at the virtual tree planting for this event, if folks can include hashtag tree equity, hashtag reconciliation, hashtag we need the federal government to step up and be a partner in what we're all doing, that would be tremendously, tremendously helpful. Next slide, please. And that's my contact information. I think it's going to be shared later on, but I'm happy to do a deeper dive or talk directly with folks who are interested in this. But with that, I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Joel, and to Lara and Zonia for great presentations. So we're going to move into now the audience Q&A portion. And Zonia had to leave because she's on call at the hospital, so she had to leave. But we have Joel and Lara here. So spotlight Lara. Let's see. There we go. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand through the raised hand icon, and you can unmute yourself, unmute your video, ask your question, or you can type it up and add it to the chat box and I can read it aloud for you. And just also a note that this is being recorded. So if you ask a question, it will be available for viewing this video recording later. So just a heads up that you could be on a video that's shared. So I see that there's a raised hand by Satoa Kinoshita. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is Satoa. I'm currently studying at the Wharton School. So kind of from that sort of more business or private sector perspective, I was wondering more if either of you could deep dive more into what perhaps private sector can do, and also if there are any sort of financially and socially and environmentally sustainable business models around these, so that other social enterprises or more sort of business organizations can push this further and faster, in addition to, or not just relying, I guess, on more nonprofit or government or federal movements as well.
Joel, I think you have big policy perspectives, so you want to dive in first?
Yes, if I can unmute myself. Yeah.
Oh, you muted yourself again.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, 2 years into Zoom calls, I can figure out mute. But that's a great question. We work with something called City Forest Credits, and really looking at innovative ways that we can encourage investment. Again, like you said, not just from the federal side and not relying on nonprofits, but really looking across the board at how we can get more money into the things that are important that we care about. And I can follow up with more information on that and pass that around. It's sort of gets a little bit complicated, since I know we have some other questions, but I do think that's a critical piece, and really looking at, because I focus on federal policy, but that's federal money is seed money, pun kind of intended. So it's really not, these things aren't sustainable. Even if we get this huge bucket of money, it's only going to be over 10 years. And so we know that this is a long-term strategy. Healthy urban tree canopy requires long-term investment. And so we need all hands on deck. And so I think there are some very specific ways that we are already working with the private sector, and that we can incentivize private investment, private capital in these sort of things.
To kind of echo off of those points and add some more, I would also say that, I mean, a lot of the just involvement I see from corporate sector in urban tree world will be like having the name of a company emblazoned on a planting event t-shirt or something. And it's a very feel-good component, but it's just one component. And the kind of work that Zonia, who left us, is doing is so critical. I mean, that organization is doing all this amazing work in Southwest Philly where there wasn't nearly enough work. Like UC Green that I mentioned doesn't go that far south as to where her group is working. But I feel like tree planting can be this kind of sexy photo op, shiny object that gets all the attention. And there's so many other things to sponsor and to partner on. And that would include workforce development kind of stuff. So the green jobs and engaging underrepresented youth kind of angle. There's also trying to put more, not just money, but like creative thinking and partnerships towards the whole life cycle of a tree, towards thinking about preservation. Some colleagues and I have had ideas on research for all. We haven't quite seen this pan out, but we have strong suspicions that a leading cause of canopy loss is development and construction. So trees that come out that weren't like sick, but that had to come out as part of a construction effort. And can there be more policies to support there? Can there be more inroads with the business community of real estate developers and redevelopers to try to make inroads there? The last piece I would actually put has to do with like more green equipment, because although trees themselves save carbon, some tree care activities use carbon. And so it's actually really important to have more, say, like leaf blowers that are low emission. And so that's a big area of like investment in technology and really just making more of those like green products and green services available as part of the like landscaping and tree care sector.
Thanks very much. That's a lot of good food for thought. I appreciate it.
So we have a question from Simon Richter, who is the man behind Comment Week. So thank you for making this happen, and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, I really love this panel. Thank you so much. I have a bundle of three slightly related questions. Zonia, I think, mentioned that there are tree species that are preferred now because they, let's say, I guess, get along with sidewalks better and fit in to the urban landscape better. I'm wondering, what are those tree species? I hope that the two of you will be able to help me with that. And then I also wanted to ask about biodiversity in trees. So the critters and other things that come along with the trees, desirable or undesirable, or what are your thoughts about biodiversity? And then also fruit-bearing trees, whether it's nuts or other fruit. So foraging and the kind of services that can be provided in an urban setting, whether that's something that you also think about.
I'd like to dive in with the first question of like changing species composition or preferences or so on. I've done way too much digging into the archives of what's been advertised by nurseries in the past, what people prioritized in the past, what's prioritized now. And some of the big shifts that have happened include, there's this like right tree, right place concept in arboriculture, and it means planting the right tree in the right spot. It has to do with more than just overhead power lines. It has to do with like soil conditions and other conditions. However, that phrase, right tree, right place, has really been pushed by the utility companies. And so where today in neighborhoods like mine, I'm in Cheltenham, just outside the city, we have lots of giant trees under power lines. And you'll see that throughout many neighborhoods of Philadelphia when, say, like the street trees have survived, you'll see old Nora maples or London planes under power lines. That would not be approved there anymore. If a tree does get approved in that spot, it's going to be a small stature tree, something like a crabapple or maybe a cherry, depending how like low the wires are. So that combined with a general like shift away from pushing trees for shade and thermal comfort and thinking of like street corridors as like for shade trees, more towards all these other ecosystem services and more towards worries again about like infrastructure conflicts, I think we see a big shift away from essentially monocultures of big, large stature trees to somewhat more diversity, but especially like different species choices for smaller trees. And there's also some just huge changes in terms of like species that were planted in the past, no one's going to plant anymore because they're considered invasive, like Nori maple. Those were kind of not on the radar of people making planting decisions in the past. There can still be like underground conflicts in terms of things like, say, a tree root getting in a pipe, but as someone who experienced that at my own property, I mean, yeah, the old Nori maple was planted kind of on top of the sewer pipe. That was a bad choice, but it's also a 100-year-old sewer pipe. So it's going to have problems regardless. And I think sometimes we blame things on trees that are more the natural result of aging gray infrastructure. Nonetheless, I do think it is sort of a reality of planting trees in dense urban landscapes near sidewalks and build, like there are going to be conflicts. And it's really a matter of how do we maintain the trees and prune them or take them out when necessary or pick the right species and do all those other actions to help it be less conflict than if the trees were not paid attention to. And I'll also address your third question because I've forgotten already what the second one was, but about fruit-bearing trees. Yeah, there's lots of awesome programs in that area. So Philadelphia Orchard Project here in Philly does great work in that regard. And some of, I think, the most like exciting work supporting fruit-bearing trees has to do with garden landscapes or other kind of community spaces where there's interest from different communities, especially possibly different immigrant groups that might have an affinity to a certain species, certain type of fruit. There's lots of exciting work in that regard. There can be sometimes worry though about fruits if someone's not going to harvest it, that it'll be messy. So you have to like make sure that the fruit trees are in the right spot, in the right green space where someone actually wants to harvest it.
Yeah, I think Lara certainly knows much more about all of those things and covered everything well. I would just say from a policy perspective, again, we start talking about $3 billion or large increases in the amount of money that goes to urban and community forestry. We do hear from a lot of folks, we can't just, it's not about just throwing money at planting trees. So it is about now that I know it's a industry term, maybe I'll use it a little bit less, but it is about the right place, right tree at the right place. And so I think from a policy perspective, you want to make sure that the funding is incentivizing comprehensive plans that are putting forward all of those ideas that Laura just mentioned, not just, we're not going to just plant a bunch of trees and walk away, but we're really embedded in the community and talking about what's the right tree to plant, or how are we making sure the right species are being planted, the right plans are in place to protect those trees. And so just making sure that that's not only written into the eligibilities of any grant program or federal resources, but that's also a priority for technical assistance that USDA Forest Service provides, and that when it does get to a competitive grant process for getting this money out the door, that communities are encouraged to really be looking all of that and include that in their proposals that they're submitting forward. And I will mention on the, I'm so glad the question on fruit-bearing trees has come up, because one of the challenges from a policy space is that, I'm talking about an urban program within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Department of Agriculture by nature is a very rural focused, non-urban focused agency. And so, and when you do talk about urban areas, it's really about agriculture, not necessarily about forestry. And so I think the more that we can support and talk about things like the Philadelphia Orchard Project and examples of that all across the country, and showing how these things are all interrelated and connected. They're not just, you can't just look at agriculture here and then look here. But if we're going to create healthy ecosystems and live together, we have to also be looking at things like fruit-bearing trees, where 80% of us live. Urban and community forestry, just to reiterate, is talking about U.S. Census defined communities of 2,500 and up. So it's not just downtown Philadelphia. We're talking about suburbs, small towns. 308 million of Americans live in what is considered an urban area. So I think it's important to note that. And I think when we're talking about U.S. territories and other places like that, fruit-bearing trees and things of that nature are really, really important.
Can I actually throw in one more little thought? And that is that the fruit-bearing trees and the flowering trees are sometimes what appeal the most to residents. So for instance, the Tree Philly program at Philly Parks and Rec had like a particular planting season one time where they were just giving away fruiting and flowering trees, because they know through experience that's what can appeal a lot to residents. Tell a resident, I want to give you this tree that's going to get giant. Some people might get nervous by that, or they think I don't have enough space for that. But the aesthetics and the idea of getting fresh fruit can be very appealing. So it's just a great way of getting entryway into audiences that might not otherwise think of getting trees.
So we have a question, a raised hand from Hannah Yee. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. My name is Hannah. I'm a Panelists student. I was just wondering, with the current tree planting efforts in the urban area, is climate change taken into consideration? Does it pose any challenge to the maintenance and preservation of existing trees, for example, in Philly? And are there like changes need to be made for like new trees to be planted going forward? Thank you.
There's definitely considerations for it, but it's very tricky. I mean, I almost don't even know how to answer this quickly. There's species that we're currently, say like in Philadelphia at the southern end maybe of where they should be planted. Okay, you can keep planting those, but what if we're at a different end? Like, it all depends on where you think that tree could naturally occur, or if it's a non-native but non-invasive species where it might exist in the future. So there's definitely considerations of just what should we stop planting, like what needs a cold winter and doesn't currently get it or won't get it in another decade or two. Another actually huge aspect of diversifying the urban forest in terms of like planting palettes, including for climate change, as well as any other considerations that might be involved there, is just nursery availability. So what can you buy at a nursery? The nurseries don't grow things that they don't have confidence will be sold. And so some colleagues in Florida did some planting trials and are trying to get some like big, actually USDA funded national collaboration together to try to crack this nut, because people in the nursery industry are often quite willing to do it. They just need advanced procurement contracts and need some guarantee that these kind of experimental underutilized species are actually going to be bought and planted. And if there's something that's being planted in anticipation of future climate, they just don't have a track record of like selling that particular tree in that particular area. So that's my thoughts on climate change as far as like species selection goes.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat for Joel, specifically asking, it's from Elizabeth Main, and she's asking regarding workforce development. You mentioned the need for jobs in the field to be year-round rather than just seasonal, which is so important. I'm curious what some of the work that can be done in the off-season looks like to maintain a sustainable and equitable workforce.
Yeah, and again, Laura has much more expertise than I do on like the specific activities that can be done, but there's plenty of protection and maintenance and long-term care activities that can be done throughout the year. I think of it a little bit more big picture in terms of a real workforce development program is giving people the skills they need, so that even if they don't have a career as an urban forester, they're getting licenses and certificates in terms of workforce safety accreditations and really those sort of things. So yeah, I'm happy. Laura may have some more specifics, and we have Sarah Anderson leads our career pathways work, and I could get a detailed list from her of sort of what the activities are. But from a policy standpoint, I just think holistically about real workforce development is not just hiring people to plant and prune and care for trees, but giving them the skills to build, transferable skills to build careers in a number of areas, particularly folks who are facing barriers to entering the workforce.
As a plug on that, Joel, PowerCore in Philadelphia does some of those things. And yes, great program.
Yeah.
Some other people I'm working with have been examining their operations and how it relates to urban forestry in Philadelphia.
And I know the Pennsylvania, I'm forgetting what it is in Pennsylvania, but the Department of Natural Resources has a recidivism program where they're doing urban forestry with folks who are trying to re-enter the workforce, been previously incarcerated and have other issues. And so, yeah, I think there's lots of great opportunities and plenty of work to do year round.
So we have a couple minutes left, and there's one more question in the chat box. And this is for Laura specifically from Dylan Schubert. And he asks, are you familiar with any research or consideration on the benefit of promoting healthy mycorrhizal networks in urban tree planting? Apologies if I'm pronouncing that word wrong, but go ahead, Laura.
Mycorrhizal. So the mycorrhizal networks, these fungal networks with roots, there must be some. I can't think of any particular papers off the top of my head. I will say that a lot more of the research and attention when it comes to thinking about below ground environments and healthy soils for growing trees comes in the form of different soil amendments and kind of structural changes that could happen at planting. So things like the very complex infiltration systems that go into planting installations done for green stormwater infrastructure, for instance. When trees are used in such settings, it's often highly engineered spaces underground. Or there's different things that are marketed by different companies. There's one called Silvacells, there's something called structural soils, all these different things that are a lot of money actually to pay during installation. And there must be some consideration for mycorrhizal networks. I'm not aware of particulars, but I'll say that the kind of reality though is that most of the trees that are planted are in whatever soil exists there. So usually, again, like the money's for planting, not for like total redesign of a landscape or something that would drastically change what's going on below ground structurally or ecologically. If there have been attempts to say like inject some fungi and see what happens, I'm not aware of them, but that could be really cool. I mean, again, it's often thinking of like highly technical like amendments that might be possible. Like let's add biochar, let's see how that, mixing that in with the soil that's already there will help. But I think again, having a bigger view of like what does it take to sustain these urban forests and maintain them over the long haul might involve more of an investment in when you plant, replacing or drastically amending the soil that's there to give these trees the best shot at surviving and growing large.
So that is a great way to end this conversation with really interesting things to think about and a great question and just a great panel. So thank you so much, Laura and Joel and Zonia, and also thank you, Natalie Walker, for organizing this event. And please be sure to check out the tree planting that's happening on Saturday and the other Climate Week events happening. So I think that there is contact information for the panelists that will be shared and you can feel free to reach out and keep the conversation going. So thank you so much again, everyone.